We're the first generation to be impacted by AI. It's coming through, it's changing our lives. But equally, we're probably also the last generation who can have an impact on AI in terms of setting the rules of the road, in terms of the regulation, in terms of what's happening. And then we've now got to a world where effectively we're all getting a bubble of one now, if you like, of media feeds. We're all getting our own individual content flows. People I talk to, I'm no longer sure that we're operating with the same basis of facts. We're no longer sure we're even talking about the same events. AGI and agentic AI in the sense that actually you can replace a human being. All the evidence I see is that most of the places where AI works really well is when it's paired with a human being who knows what they're doing. And so this provides a really massive economic challenge for the UK. The only possible answer is we have to lean into it. But as they lean into it, we're fundamentally leaning into a US tech layer, which is, as you say, owned by the Americans. And it's not just one layer, it's the models, it's the chips, it's the cloud base, it's the underlying data structures, it's a lot of the companies who power this stuff.
This week on Gaia Talks, we have Tim Gordon from Best Practice AI. Good to have you here.
Good to be here.
What's your current take on AI as it stands today?
I think we're in a moment which is a bit like the dot-com boom, where the entire world is getting excited about something. AI's gone from being something which was sort of, I started my firm back in 2018. Literally people at the time said, why are you in AI? You don't know it, one end of a cow from another. And so we moved to the world where actually AI's gone bring something people that we understand into something that now is everywhere and everyone's talking about it all the time. So we're in a bit of a bubble stage. But to some extent, the technology and what we think it can do is ahead of probably where it really is in terms of economic value at the moment. And so we're probably due some sort of redressment, financial redressment and so on. And that's when things get interesting. Because you think about the dot-com boom, in 2001, when it sort of spluttered out, e-commerce at that stage, effectively the punchline was, thank you for looking at our website, here's our address, please send us a check. And Amazon went away and spent the next 5, 6, 7 years working out how to do credit card ordering, how to do one-click ordering, how to do online returns and so on. And within 6, 7 years, they basically owned the entire e-commerce space. And we're about to enter the same sort of cycle with AI, where we'll come through this bit, the thing will sort of fall apart, people will go, what was that about? And the ones who keep going, keep investing, keep thinking through, reorganizing, restructuring their workflows, they will be the winners of the next cycle.
I mean, it's definitely a time of huge change. And for some context, your background, give us an idea from the beginning. Tim the kid, what was your journey from childhood onwards? Because I think it's very important for the context of how you've come to the conclusions, how you think about things.
So I've done a bunch of things. My first job was teaching in Zimbabwe. I then studied history, but my career fundamentally has been being mugged by technology. So I started my career at the Financial Times in the newspaper industry. The newspaper industry used to be an industry which was phenomenally successful, very powerful, employed lots of people, and then the internet came along, and we all know what's happened there. I worked briefly I worked at the Boston Consulting Group for a while, and I then went to join the board of a Yellow Page business. Do you remember the Yellow Page business? These great big fat books full of advertising, unbelievably successful. 40% margins, 80% cash conversion, everyone loved them, and then Google came along, and that industry kind of evaporated. I then spent some time as chief executive of a political party, and it's fair to say that politics also, as another relatively stable industry, has been massively disrupted by the rise of social media, so the next wave of technology that came through. I'm now a strategy consultant, and ChatGPT's arrived. I can pretty much guess what's going to happen to my industry as well.
So what does history tell you, and what was your focus of history?
So I did a bunch of different stuff. The bit that I think I find most useful at the moment, though, is thinking back to the end of the Middle Ages. And at the end of the Middle Ages, the printing press was developed in 1450 or something. And the printing press has been probably the most important invention in human history, because it essentially unlocked the economics of information. And you went from a world where monks would scribe individual lines and turned it into something where they could be mass produced, and therefore information could spread, education could spread. You got the basis of the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, and so on. It's the reason why we're sat here in a nice podcast studio talking about things, as opposed to both being out sort of, taking care of pigs in the forest. And so it has been the most unbelievably powerful shift. But equally, the printing press destroyed the gatekeepers of power and information, which was the Catholic Church. And we basically triggered 200 years of people squabbling around what truth was, people squabbling around how the world really worked, and we had religious wars for 200 years. So these massive shifts you're seeing, I think, again, with digital technology, with AI and so on, around how information economics works, is both the most incredibly powerful thing, but also is one of the scariest things, which is how do we avoid 100, 200 years of religious wars to get to the next level of stability and really capture the benefits of this.
And if we look at what has happened with world events, with the shift in politics, a relative division in different parts of the world, and that point that you've just mentioned there, what truth is. So if we look at the advent of the internet, that was obviously a huge thing. So we look at the promise and the reality. So the promise being everyone can have access to everything. The reality was people could access everything, but access a small amount. Exactly. Then the second wave of that tech revolution, in essence, social media, which is a distillation of information, all curated in music, Spotify, and normal culture, I suppose Facebook in one part, Instagram in others. And that's a further kind of incremental narrowing of what truth is, siloing, which I suppose has a direct relationship with politics, and the introduction of influence over the communication of data. This phase, with the likes of ChatGPT, where we're taking everything in the internet and influence and curating it through a handful of mediums to serve up. It may seem convenient, but it leads very much to something I'm passionate about, and I know you're passionate about, which is how we look at the ethics of AI, look into the truth basis of AI, and what happens when you lose that chain of connectivity of what information is and a flow of what could be considered the truth, and as in the integrity of that information, whether that be also opinion or comment or empirical or of any nature, but the integrity flow and the ability to look back at that information and say, has it been diluted, influenced, polluted? How do you deal with that?
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I'm a trustee at Full Fact, which is the UK's leading fact-checking organization. And you go back to the origins of that organization maybe 12 years ago or so. And fundamentally, it's about saying, look, there's a certain number of MPs, there's a certain number of newspapers, there's a certain number of people who produce statistics, and our job is to try and make sure that they're being as factual as possible. If they make errors, we'll ask them to correct them. We'll try and basically drive a sense of truthfulness around this stuff. The world has now evolved to a place, though, where essentially the fact-checking story is Mrs. Miggins can be sitting at home producing content that says you should all drink bleach to avoid whatever the disease might be, and her videos are going viral on the internet. And so this explosion, if you like, of tools in different ways that are basically driving more and more chances for misinformation and disinformation. Second thing, as you pointed out, you've got essentially this consolidation of power where we're all basically living our lives through a certain number of platforms. And these platforms are driven by algorithms, which are the new gatekeepers, if you like, of what people see. And part of the challenge for the UK, at least, is that those platforms are all essentially non-UK platforms. They're all international platforms. And particularly in the current political environment, they don't particularly care what the UK government or the UK political discourse thinks about this stuff. So having these political discussions on platforms which are effectively foreign territory that are driving a lot of the conversation. And then we've now got to a world where effectively the algorithm has become more and more powerful. And you think about the transition of the algorithm in the media industry. It starts off being, you might also like. So you might, for example, you go to the BBC website, you read an article about the Chancellor's speech, you might also like this article about the politics, you might also like this, you might also like that. And basically the algorithm has gone from being the sort of thing at the end of the story to being the entire product. ChatGPT now is the product. TikTok is basically you're there training the algorithm on what you like or don't like. Your job as a consumer is to train the algorithm to produce more and more competitive, essentially almost addictive content for other consumers. And so we're moving to this world where we're all getting a bubble of one now, if you like, of media feeds. We're all getting our own individual content flows. One of the things I've observed, even over the last year or two, is that people I talk to, I'm no longer sure that we're operating with the same basis of facts. We're no longer sure we're even talking about the same events. If you watch TikTok over the summer, this country was essentially a race war. And everywhere you looked, you could just see sort of stories of this and stories of that and stories of something else. That wasn't the experience I was living. It wasn't the experience 99.9% of my fellow citizens were living in reality. But that ability to basically give people more and more personalized, focused information at algorithms which are most of them banana control, but occasionally people want to tip the angles there, is I think creating a real crisis, because you move to a world where it's very, very hard to have a political unity or political sense of trying to do something and going forward together. And clearly we've got more and more governments in this country which seem to be falling at faster and faster pace. And partly that's because they're maybe not very good, but also that may be partly because they're operating in an information environment where effectively we're being fragmented and driven towards the whole sort of the attention economics all the way through.
In a way, it's like we're in a large psyops operation.
Yes.
Which a point that we've discussed in a lot of our guests, and you have your own podcast, which I'd love you to tell me more about. But the premise of education, so we're privileged in the sense that we have access to information, we're engaged in understanding how things work. You know, if we want to look at how transformers work, we know what we mean by that. We know about what trusted information is. We know about the integrity of data throughout pipelines of AI. We understand the wider premise. We're privileged to be able to communicate with lots of people to get different perspectives. And it's probably a really important thing. If people making decisions, and obviously politics is one thing, but you could look at business, you could look at our own everyday lives. It's across the entire divide in many ways. If people are not educated with some base fundamentals of how things work, and we're very new in this current phase of AI, but as people do begin to understand, hopefully that can give them some choice back. But what kind of decisions can we expect to see when the decision makers representing us that we work for, work with, are not on the same page? And you mentioned a really critical point there. Everyone you deal with seems to have a different perspective of what facts and reality are. What happens until we can figure out how we can all agree the same thing is the same truth?
So two things. One of the is AI. To be honest, I've actually been impressed by how fast the political world at least has picked up on AI. So if you think back to the congressional hearings they had with Mark Zuckerberg around social media, and these guys were saying, look, you know, how do you get paid? And sort of not even understanding that effectively this is a large advertising model. Whereas the conversations they had even a few years later around AI, I think were far more considered and far more learned. And I would observe that I think politicians generally are leaning into AI in a more sort of thoughtful way than often they did with maybe some of the social media stuff. I think to your point about truth, though, and sort of people having different views and stuff, and this predates AI. I think back to the Brexit battles, and clearly I worked for the Liberal Democrats. I was very clearly on one side of the Brexit fight, and you know, a lot of people accuse the other side of being very misinformed. I would observe that my own side was also equally misinformed, and a whole series of sort of, you know, conspiracy theories about Russian psyops and so on sort of drove a huge amount of the internal debate and worry and discussion. And to some extent, you know, we're in a place now where there is psyops happening in all different directions, probably just to create the noise and so on. And I don't think we as a country, or most countries, have really sat down and thought through how we fight the psyops battle. But then equally, it's a sense actually of we're getting more and more personalized information, which, well, it's unbelievably powerful. We're getting tools that help us to learn things at our own pace. We're getting ways to discover information that really matters to us individually. We're getting it described in words. You know, I ask these tools to talk to me as I'm a 12-year-old to explain complex things. So all this stuff is incredibly powerful, but the counterfact is you move to a world where we no longer have the same stuff. And so I think it's brilliant that you've got this personalized material, but equally there's a massive danger to it. And I just think part of the debate here is we need to be very excited about the stuff that's coming, but equally worried about the poor stuff that's coming. And to your point, we therefore need to be educated and think this stuff through to get to a place where we know the answer is. But the bottom line is no one yet knows the answer. So I work with lots of companies on thinking through AI, and I cannot stand in front of those companies and go, this is the answer, because I don't know. This is, we're 3 years into ChatGPT. Clearly, we've had GPT-3 and so on. Before then, we've had NLP a lot longer. But we're still at a very early stage of the cycle. So it's more about actually how can we all learn together, keep our minds open, and make sure we're sharing stuff that flows through.
I mean, the introduction of choice, and choice being, let's say we're at a juncture in the evolution of the modern AI world. We're very clear and apparent. We've had the very generalized, large model approach served by singular entities, even if those singular entities are powering a lot of potentially business applications through the likes of Copilot. The alternative, which hasn't really been explored, and understandably because the majority of the budget, the noise, the marketing, the narrative has been led by the companies, as you correctly described, were probably there at the beginning and realized, right, we need to evolve, and took a massive amount of market share of the internet and then social media. So the forefront, the big guns, so to speak. The alternative, or the other junction and route, is the edge-based capability, or a synthetic edge and private cloud hybrid, where it's more focused on specificity. And an observation that I've had in every business in general, if you simplify things down, each person that works for a company is employed for a specific role, a function, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, they're measured against a particular metric which has a relationship with their employment. Even as a business owner, you go into a business for a particular function in a particular sector, and your business is probably unlike any other business. It may have similarities in how it's affected by the outside world, but the uniqueness, so it's different to personalized to a point, but unique in its function, where you have your own data and you don't want to pollute that data or give that data away. So you retain sovereignty, and it trains and learns, and you get all the upside of AI on specificity, which increases performance and output, which is you're effectively creating your own truth, because you can trust your own sales figures. You can trust your own data where you have control. The version that we've had so far is really the opposite. I don't think that many people are aware that there are other choices coming online. And if you look at what the consequences are, so the pros and the cons, if you have to send your information across a continent, wherever that may be, processing happens somewhere else to come back, you're renting. You're renting and you're leaking your data, because that could be going into a big universe which you're not in control of, and there could be latency, there could be time between things. So you probably give up the capability of real time, which is very possible if you do it on a more edge-based device. You can get privacy, you can get control, you can get all these other things. Now, scalable across your organization, or even from a one-to-one basis, all of these things will become possible, but effectively the consequence of the capability is very much determined by the underlying architecture of how you deliver AI. Now, that other method is very much not in the interest of the people that make the money as massive cloud providers. So, of course, they're not necessarily going to push that initially. But it goes back to the idea of podcast, communicating what works for you. One could absolutely work, and the other could work in a different circumstance.
So I mean, the other angle of that obviously is the open source versus the closed model, and you've got the whole sort of sense of actually, where's that going to go? I mean, I think this goes to the heart actually of this whole sort of this sovereign AI type conversation. So you've got Jensen Huang from NVIDIA running around the world saying you could be sovereign, you could do your own thing. And actually, by the way, I suspect increasingly look at what they're doing, they will have more and more of these chips that could be used to actually do edge-driven computing, and given he's probably the key player. So it's not entirely always aligned around that centralized set of models. But I think this goes to the heart, actually, of the challenge for the UK economy. Think about the UK economy. The UK economy's competitive advantage in the world, I think we're uniquely good at, is arguing well in English. So you think about marketing, you think about consulting, you think about education, you think about law, you think about publishing, you think music, you think all the industries that we're fundamentally good at. It comes down to arguing well in English as our core skill. Now, what do these tools do out of a box? They argue incredibly well in English. And so therefore, we face a real structural challenge, which is how do we lead into this coming challenge? And people say, is this going to lead to less jobs? I personally believe that most industrial revolutions, at the end, there are more jobs than there were at the beginning. The problem is specific areas may be in a different place. So the Industrial Revolution was net good for humanity, really awful if you're a weaver in India. And I think one of the challenges for the UK, at least, is we're one of those places where we could be a net loser, even as places like Africa, whole chunks of the world are massively liberated and released by these new tools. And so this provides a really massive economic challenge for the UK. The only possible answer is we have to lean into it. We have to say we have a whole bunch of industries, the city, for example, that maybe service 20,000 companies worldwide. What's going to stop them servicing 2 million companies worldwide? If they use AI, they lean into this thing. But as they lean into it, we're fundamentally leaning into a US tech layer, which is, as you say, owned by the Americans. And it's not just one layer, it's the models, it's the chips, it's the cloud base, it's the underlying data structures, it's a lot of the companies who power this stuff. What does that therefore mean for a country where our biggest single competitor in the service industry is the United States? And so there's a really big sort of, I think, strategic industrial conundrum for the UK, which is we have to go this way, but as we do, we're increasing our reliance on other people. And over time, that AI is going to become a bigger and bigger chunk of the value stack for companies because it'll get better at what it does, it'll increasingly do more and more tasks, it'll become the operating system. So law firms, for example, they'll start using these tools like Harvey and so on to do various things. And over time, it'll become a bigger and bigger chunk of the value add. At some stage, they'll almost be reselling these tools, become resellers of Harvey as opposed to, with a bit of sort of front end, back end stuff as well. So it's really thinking through how you can retain the value as you move to a world where things are going forward. And you're entirely right, the way you structure your setup has all sorts of questions around how you deliver your services and latency and so on. But I think the biggest question for me is really how does a country like the UK or how do non-US countries retain the value add as they build these services going forward?
Well, a good comparison now, just as you're talking, I'm thinking of this. You think of Hollywood. So people think Hollywood films. Yes. But if you look at the reality of the execution of a lot of these major films, where was Bond, Mission Impossible?
Pinewood's been the biggest studio in the world, right?
Yeah. The British talent.
Yes.
Right? The experience and the expertise, the continuation of extremely valuable knowledge and the practicality. And I think this is where it comes down to the value of the human. If you look at the support the UK economy has had, or the government has given to creating a very successful film industry, it's a multi-billion industry.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't get the headline credit, so to speak. Maybe that's not where the money originates from, but it's where it's spent. And it's because we have incredible talent here, from set designers to every particular facet of the film industry. And we could see something a bit like that, where what is the one thing that we've always had, and we talked about earlier, someone we spoke to recently from the internet side, from the birthplace of computing, we could look throughout a whole history of the last millennia and think many absolutely critical discoveries and inventions and ways of thinking. I mean, from where I'm from, Stephenson's rocket. Look at so many different elements of engineering. That's what we have here. It's inherent with how we operate as a country. If the education system continues to serve or evolves to serve the output of high quality thinking, and that we leverage the human experience, because the reality is you can ask any model to do something, and as soon as you get specific, it'll give a plausible answer, but it's no match to real experience, the aggregation of years of understanding the nuances, understanding the value that humans have. And there is a kind of antithesis to the apathy of, well, everything I'm seeing is probably AI generated, so the only thing that I'm going to trust is what I can see, and dialogue and engagement and creativity and the human experience. If we can leverage that, then that's an exportable superpower.
So the first great human being to be beaten by AI was Garry Kasparov back in '97. He lost his, he didn't lose, but he was beaten by IBM's chess computer. He was very grumpy for a while. He understandably went away and complained about various things, but he then spent time thinking about it. He came back with this whole concept of centaurs. This concept basically is human plus machine will beat machine on its own or human on its own. And actually, look at how Gen AI is being used at the moment. That's pretty much what you're saying. Humans in the loop are able to do things they couldn't do before. It gives people the ability to almost have superpowers. Before you could look at maybe 100 images, now you could look at 10,000 images and choose the 100 most useful ones. Most of the tools, essentially, AI is providing triage support to make people better at their jobs. And I think part of the whole challenge here is how we don't there's a sort of myth that's built, an image that's being created by the guys trying to generate billions of dollars to build their next data center, which is all about AGI and agentic AI in the sense that actually you can replace a human being. All the evidence I see is that most of the places where AI works really well is when it's paired with a human being who knows what they're doing. So think about coding, for example. So the great example of agentic AI. The people who are doing coding well using the stuff are people who know what they're doing, who know how data architecture works, who understand what good is, understand what prompts to put in, and can work through the problems. I turn up and I go, oh, vibe coding, it's great. And it's a car crash within like half an hour because it just...
There's no benchmark.
I don't know enough about coding to get it right. And then I ask Claude or someone to fix it and it just sort of cycles further into doom loop. There's that sense actually of how humans plus AI can work together to deliver new paradigms, new products, new ways forward, which I think is the opportunity. And part of the challenge, I think, with how people are approaching AI at the moment is they sort of go, oh, it's 20% productivity. Well, show me some cost savings. So private equity, for example, turns up and goes, let's AI this business, we'll take all this cost out. Actually, the way it works is human beings work well with AI, and you tell them that you do AI well and you'll lose 20% of your people, you begin to get problems, and also you're kind of chopping off an arm and a leg. And so what I think we're sort of missing at the moment is the way in which AI can be used as a massive enhancer for people to do things they couldn't do before. So at Full Fact, for example, we're using it now to look at lots and lots of YouTube videos and find out which ones have got the worst of the health misinformation in them. So we're suddenly able to do a whole bunch of things we couldn't imagine doing before because it's been way too expensive and taken too much time. And so I think part of the opportunity for the UK, which is one of the great AI countries in terms of the skill set, the knowledge, and so on, is even if we don't have some of the capital to build these huge tools, the GPTs of our own, is actually become the country that shows the world, to your point, how we can use these tools to take our existing really rich, powerful human talent and take it to the next level. And it's AI plus people who know what they're doing that at the moment looks like the most powerful way to deploy AI. And so you can see that being something that works in the film industry. You can see it working in a whole bunch of places. But part of that is we have to have the courage to lead it to do it. We've got to get away from the mindset of this is a great way to save lots of money. Because when you get that, you're going to get every organization with resistance to deploying AI, and you get to a real challenging place. And most of the clients I work with, I find the most exciting stuff is this innovation that's coming up through the floorboards. And the chief executive can get very excited about it and give the big picture stuff, which is great and important to provide support and to set the rules of the road. They need to provide the tools, they need to provide training. But most of the interesting stuff actually is coming up through the floorboards.
In many ways, it's expertise on scale. That and I think the question why, for anything, you could look at any walk of life, any moment in life, why? It sounds very basic, simple question, but why? Well, what are you trying to achieve?
Yes.
What would you like to achieve? And instead of looking at this is how it's done, we can create efficiency, and I agree with that. It's a bit of a red herring, that whole argument of, we can do cost savings. Well, if you look at what you could do with expertise on scale, and you could 4x the amount of revenue per employee,
yes,
then that far outweighs a 20% cost saving, the kind of short-term thinking. But what are you trying to achieve? And as I say, every business has a function. Well, imagining new ways. I don't see AI doing that because it's not drawing upon innovative thinking as such. And we can claim certain things work in a certain way, and it could be possible. I'm sure there are ways, but again, that's got to communicate with a human, and the human's got to understand, because AIs do not control budgets. They don't do interviews to employ people. They're not making the actual critical decisions that are making the difference. Because really, all business is a human business. Because you took the humans out,
So you say that. But if, for example, I've got a business that I want to employ lots of people, the process goes, well, probably I use AI to write the job spec. Most of the people who apply for that job have used AI to personalize the letters, transform their CVs, etc. So it goes in. AI is doing the first cut as to which people should be interviewed. They're then often doing an online AI video interview to get through the first round, which AI is then making another decision. So what we've actually got is you've got four multiple steps in one of the most critical career decision paths, particularly young people who are coming into these jobs, are now being taken by AI. And so part of what we're doing is AI is increasingly going to be used to actually fill in chunks. Now the final decision hopefully is still being made by a human being. But essentially, you've got this disintermediation happening where AI is coming in, and same with the content we were talking about earlier, AI is beginning to disintermediate humans and begin to make decisions around this stuff. And I think one of the challenges then is clearly, well, what's the bias that's sitting in the system? What's the issues that's sitting behind them? And you mentioned before, in my own data, I know it works because it's my own data. Maybe, but your own data also has a whole bunch of biases in it. And one of the most famous examples is the Amazon recruitment algorithm, where effectively it turned out that the recruitment algorithm was bringing in lots of sort of white or East Asian engineers, and female candidates and maybe African American candidates were falling behind. And that's because it was trained on their own internal data, which was trained on the history of the decisions they've been making. And so I think it's a real challenge here, which is, we need to get to a place where we make this work.
But who would have caught that? Or what would have caught that?
What I like about it is that was a long-term issue that would always be said, oh no, we've got some bad apples. Oh no, we make a few bad decisions, but broadly it's fine. Mathematically, the evidence was now clear that actually the only way the algorithm could make it work was to feed back, well, female captain of the volleyball team is worth half the points of male captain of the volleyball team. So it's doing these funny things to make it work. And actually AI was a chance to hold a mirror to that organization and go, here's something we're getting wrong in the real world. How should we get it right in the real world as well? And I think the challenge here is, to your point, who caught that? How do you have the teams internally who can have the conversations? How do you have the diversity around the table when you're designing the systems and getting the feedback to begin to understand maybe what's working, maybe what isn't working? But I think this is a bit that sort of plays really critically to humans, to your point, in this mix who get that stuff right. And they've got to be at a place where they can understand, look, something's happening here, we need to understand it.
Because it goes to the point of control. Are you in control of the AI, or is the AI in control of you? Very simplistic terminology. Now you can look at lots of tasks and functions, and you can achieve the elements of scale. You can see things which were otherwise not seen because the data sets were too large, or it was over too much of a period of time. But instinctively, we notice things. Instinctively, we see things. I mean, I often find this doing some work in and around vision AI. If you have to sit on your hands like this and speak, you completely change. How you communicate completely changes.
Right.
Because there's
How do you check what changes?
You don't express.
Okay.
You're not moving.
Right.
There's no naturalness. Things become more rigid. The nature of what you'll speak about is different. I mean, you can try it now.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, it's just peculiar now.
Sweet. Yes.
You're very conscious.
Yeah.
Everything just changes.
Yeah.
So how much is actually language? How much is additional communication, additional information, which perhaps is not being considered? And actually, there's a vast amount of information where it's almost arrogant to assume, well, this is the data set, and we're only really looking at 10%.
Yeah.
Because you can have conversations with people and say, how are you doing? Yeah, I'm fine. And the words don't match what you know to be correct. You go, if you're fine, it's all good then. Yeah.
So world model is going to get better and better at understanding the human beings, linking with them and so on. I think one of the points you mentioned there is who's in charge. I think that's one of the really big battles of the coming years. So I've talked to, for example, clients of mine who are saying, look, we our frontline managers of coders don't really want to talk to the coders. What they want is an AI tool that will do the weekly meeting or daily catch up with the coder and tell the manager what's being told and give them the frontline support. So already you're seeing a place where people are going, it's about uncomfortable talking to human beings. Everyone actually likes to talk to the AI because the AI is kind of cooler and more useful. And how do you get to a place where that works? We had a member of staff who, for example, was a remote coder. and he used to talk to his boss using Gen AI. And actually, the boss quite liked it because it made the guy more communicative and more. So once again, the disintermediation coming. And then at the other end of the table, you've got in China now, they've got a President Xi-bot, which will basically join your board and give you feedback on, what's going on, is how do your strategic plans tie up to the nature of, the bigger picture of where China needs to go. You've got organizations that are trying to take their chief executives and turn them, maybe former chief executives or founders, and turn them into models that can be part of the online conversation. So you're a place where, we get these digital versions of people that increasingly become controllers, guidance, whatever it might be. And I think, we need to kind of really remind ourselves where the human is in control and where, the algorithm's in control. If you're an Uber driver, already you're effectively working for an algorithmic boss. And so these are the bits where we're going to more and more find ourselves working for algorithmic bosses. And, because you can begin to capture more and more data and do more and more with that data, you'll begin to get to a place where people suddenly start discovering they're effectively working for these organizations. So every meeting now that can be basically transcribed live by AI can then be measured later on. How good was your decision-making process? Who said the right things? What do people do in meetings? And so you've got these coaching tools that at the moment are coaching tools, but at times will become maybe a bit more than just coaching tools. Metrics and measurements and so on and so forth. And the danger there clearly is you set yourself down a certain track with the metrics, and everyone ends up trying to conform to the tool. And we're already seeing that. I'm not saying you or I, but people will behave better with their Uber driver because they want to make sure they get the right Uber rating. So already we're in a place where we're beginning to sort of do our bit, transform how we behave to make the algorithm happy. We write differently on LinkedIn because we're trying to make sure the algorithm is nice to us. So we're moving to a world where we're all going to start, humans are the most flexible things. We're far more flexible than AI. AI is very clever, does lots of stuff, but we're fundamentally flexible. And we're going to transform ourselves to work with AI in the same way that humans transformed ourselves, contorted ourselves to work with cars. Cars, massive economic benefit, they kill millions of us, but we are prepared to contort ourselves and sacrifice ourselves to capture those benefits. And I think in the next few decades, we'll do the same with AI, which is AI is really good at a bunch of stuff, and we'll make ourselves work with the AI as much as the other way around.
So many
that's the battle. Who wins that?
So on two sides, then there's almost a psychological compression into a thin stream or thinner stream of behavior, such as this is what you can say and these are all things that you can't say. So that what you can't say is kind of expanding out how you can behave and how you can't behave, because there's perceived or psychological repercussions, such as the Uber rating, for example. So that compression conformity of behavior to squish everyone into weirdly.
Well, maybe because but the winners might be the ones who literally break out of that. Because to some extent, if the more it's compressed, the easier it is to model and recreate.
Well, this is what I'm saying.
And actually, what the spiky people, who maybe use bad language or whatever, I don't know, who are the ones who will continue to drive stuff forward. And maybe that's what firms will be increasingly trying to recruit for. How do I get that spikiness? How do I get something that's going to basically move the boundary? Because the danger you've got with AI is clearly as stuff gets more and more similar, it just, you can see with Gen AI already, you're basically, you lose the interest as it crashes down onto this smaller and smaller cycle. And I think the societies that keep the ability to people do things differently and continue that spikiness may end up being the winners.
Because I was going to say, in the two sides, that compression which is happening in education as well, where it's all just conformed into that grey area.
Yeah.
But the other side to it, though, it goes back to critical thinking, of looking at what are the facts today. And part of, I suppose, history is looking back where people realize the circumstances, the data available to us today is subject to being different than it was yesterday, and tomorrow should be considered potentially different to what it was today. So everything changes, but that incremental little change, it's like the frog boiling in the water from cold. That's almost the analogy of the compression into that behavior. But if you really looked at it and said, well, what are the facts? And as there are technical innovations, as there's more capabilities, and I think as there's more awareness of the consequence of things that we perhaps haven't seen yet, but are probably inevitable, and you can appreciate the information as it stands today, knowing it's subject to change, that's where you see opportunity. I mean, that's what innovation is. That's where entrepreneurialism is. That's where it's seeing the thing that other people have failed at that moment in time to en masse recognize. Inevitably, people do see it, but it's who's first. I mean, it's the nature of a trade. I mean, a trade is literally you saw something before everybody else. So you put into position, then everyone else equalized with your view, and you take the benefit, whether that's long or short. But that's where the opportunity is. I mean, look at Jeff Bezos when everyone thought he was selling books, and he saw what the internet really meant was building an infrastructure company, because he saw before everyone else got it. In the end, everyone else aligned and thought, well, actually, that makes sense. Grew a massive, massive business, but it
Yeah.
wasn't about books.
But so I think one of the challenges of AI is that we sort of think that creativity is a uniquely human thing. I think of the number of really, really creative things I've done in my life that AI couldn't have come up with. I'm sure there are some, but I think that we sort of fetishize the sense of creativity, and actually a huge chunk of what actually happens is people spotting patterns and following those patterns, possibly in a different sector.
Acting
Acting on
upon it.
you're right, acting on patterns. I think the second thing on the trading bit more specifically, I think we're to a world though where the compute and the data advantage of people who can use compute at scale and have got the economics to support that is going to overwhelm a huge number of other players. So people are using AI compute now to do vast amounts of vision analysis to work out, I mean, on the basic level, which data centers are live, which data centers aren't live, to track trade, to track, agricultural outcomes and so on. And so that ability to take vast amounts of data, crunch it using compute and understanding what going to happen to is going to give all sorts of people unfair advantages in financial trading. And it's interesting if you look at, for example, where all the compute that's been bought in Europe is being used. It's being used on trading as opposed to on building ChatGPTs and new Gen AI models. And actually, the UK has got the same sort of level of compute spend as New York does on this stuff. So you're seeing that entire game playing out. So I think finding a way to be different in that sector is going to be interesting. Because I also suspect, I mean, once the AI bubble begins to deflate, you'll suddenly discover that actually, for example, trackers are a less useful place to be. And once again, you'll want to move probably to active managers, and they'll be using this compute to basically get ahead of the curve and spot what's coming down the track. So I think this plays in different ways. The human who could do something different is going to be especially valuable, increasingly valuable. But at the same time, that raw power of compute is going to change a lot of things.
Also, how humans can look at leveraging AI. There's something I've found fascinating for years. How old is the wheel?
Mm.
I can't exactly date it, but the wheel's been around a fair amount of time. But when was it figured out to put a wheel on a suitcase?
Mm-hmm.
It was relatively recently.
Yeah.
I mean, people were lugging big things around for years,
Mm.
and there's been billions and billions of people. Then one day, someone said, "You got this wheel thing, and you got this suit briefcase, carry case. How about put wheels on that?"
Mm.
Now everything has it,
Mm.
and it was there in front of us for God knows how many centuries,
Mm.
and nobody thought to do it.
Mm.
Yet there'd been similar applications to it. Now, figuring things out, that's where I think the perspective and the ability to act on it. So we had Professor Jim Collins on the podcast, who had used AI for creating proteins to find a new antibiotic, that was it, for the MRSA superbug and gonorrhea. And he'd gone through millions of potential variants and then figured out that something like 100 proteins, and out of them, I think 20 could be made, and out of which 2 were incredibly effective. But it's because of how he was thinking. It's because of what he did for a living. Is because of how he looked at something. And I'm pretty sure it was some sort of LLM he was using. So,
but I think the opportunity for AI to speed that sort of stuff is massive. You think about most academics; they've got more and more and more specialized. To get to the edge of the knowledge envelope and then go beyond that is kind of an entire life's work. And so they've got increasingly specialized. The history they're really detailed on specific sectors and special stuff that happened in certain time periods and so on. AI enables people to say, actually, how do I take that and bring it back to the wider world? How can I use this very specialist knowledge and re-engage with all these other fields, which are also expanding at a great pace, and actually, if you like, surf some of those connections? And you put these two totally different worlds together, you're always going to get something creative. You're always going to get something interesting. So I think the real opportunity to change things. The second big thing you can see there is, if you go back to media and journalism, a huge amount of journalism is very generalist people explaining the world of a specialist to a general audience. AI now means that can happen at scale. So suddenly academics who really know what they're talking about can now find new ways to explain to the world what they're working on. And I think, we sort of worry about, our kids getting the right education and so on. The potential explosion of knowledge here, once again, back to that printing press, back to the changing economics of how information works, I think is potentially going to lead to some really exciting things in the years ahead. We're very focused on, how do we use, the cutting edge tools to basically deliver new materials or, AlphaFold, all these amazing things that are happening. But it's almost the more sort of daily stuff where people can say, look, I've got a real expertise here. How do I tie it to the latest edge and somewhere else and put the two together and discover new stuff? I think with the right sort of structures, the UK with our big university sector, with all of the very smart people there, could be just generating so many more interesting discoveries, ideas and thoughts. And we could be at the edge of a really exciting time on that front.
I would like to have an AI, Professor Brian Cox, explain things about the universe to me when it's convenient for me, and then get him having a conversation, set them on debate with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and then bring in Richard Feynman from the past, talking about topics, and then get someone from maybe Sting, what Sting's opinion on it, and then you could get all sorts of people and say, well, what would the outcomes be there? And is it in languages? Is it in the tone of communication that I would understand, which may be different from how you'd look to have data, sort of information communicated or explore, to have thinking? I mean, I always found it fascinating. My dad was in advertising. He was an art director, and an art director always worked with a copywriter, and it was the pairs, and whether they would be at the pub just playing with ideas, and here's a headline and scamping it out, and then coming up with ideas, going for a walk. Right, the new client, it's a beer company. Well, what's the type of customer? Right, let's go explore. Let's see. Let's look at how they behave, and the ideas bouncing off each other. The idea that you could have a virtual or an augmented human AI copywriter if I'm an art director, or vice versa. Maybe you're a great copywriter and you need someone that can visualize up. So then you're looking at vision AI, looking at language AI, you're looking at also the data that it draws on. I mean, from our perspective, the idea of the LGM is to pull in massive amounts of specific data across time and space of this context. So if you can draw what you know is trusted information, then you get your own private information as well, that it all can flow through. The potential is absolutely huge, and in ways which are, as of yet, really unimagined. And I think often, if you look at what Steve Jobs did, in reality, my perspective on it, well, phones already existed, PDAs already existed, the internet already existed, cameras already existed, and it was just looking at it thinking, how can you get different technologies? Same with the mouse already existed, out of Zero Parks. You look at all these things and it's engineering something. In many ways, the next stage is engineering what works based upon all these capabilities together. Then when people see it, it's like with any product, people don't know what they want to buy until they've seen it. I want one like that, because maybe they can't imagine it. But when they do, then it sets off an entire ecosystem. I mean, who would have thought that the success of Apple would have come through small little apps on a device at the time when Mac OS was the big thing? It's the ecosystems that come off it. And in many ways, one of the greatest successes of Apple was looking at the circumstances around Napster, file sharing. I had a friend who was a CEO of one of the big MP3 player companies, one of the biggest in the market, and everyone had an MP3 player. But of course, that meant you could
But I,
Pirate Bay it and everything else. And he was taking that 20% of the global music industry
yes.
and saying, we'll allow everyone to get it, but we can protect your revenue stream.
Mm.
I mean, it's a super smart way to almost take a global industry, a 20% share of it overnight.
But I think we're about to watch a similar shift in terms of the whole sort of the form factors, the way we interact with the world. Now, it's not clear if OpenAI is going to win or not, but they're clearly believing that they can become the everything company that effectively takes on that role of being everyone's front face into the, we've got 1 billion users now, and effectively everyone's going to suddenly start using this as their pathway into the web. And instead of a web that's kind of out there massively distributed, you're going to have one thing that's in front of you that basically will then go and talk to Shopify for you, Amazon, blocked at the moment, but they'll get to a place where they can start basically becoming the one place where it happens. And on one level, it's very exciting because you get to a world where you can use these tools for faster use. You can, I'm sure you do. I use OpenAI to give me advice on what to buy. I use it to give me advice on how to fix things that are broken. So increasingly it becomes that one size fits all. Part of the challenge in all this, I think, is we're losing that massive diversity of sources that sit below it. And Google's already done this. So Google's basically moved to a world where most of Google search is advertising, and actually the sort of the underlying content providers are struggling to get their content through. But part of the reason why these tools exist so successfully is they're sitting on the legacy of 20, 30, 40 years of all this content that's been put on the internet that's out there. And what we're seeing at the moment is the long-term destruction of the economics of all the providers of content. So the copyright issue, the fact that as Google AI increasingly uses AI as the front end of a search, you're seeing these 30, 40% drop-offs in terms of click-through rates for the underlying sites. And what was dangerous, we're going to lose all the humans who basically provided this training data. And we're losing the economic world that enables that to happen. And dangerous, we end up in a world where essentially more and more Gen AI created content then feeds into other Gen AI created content, and sort of all the way up, you've got that cycle going through where you've got hallucination and the other issues happening. And part, I think, of the challenge, and part of, I think, the challenge, especially for the UK, which is a country which has got so much creative IP, people who produce content and so on, is how do we make sure we build a model where they remain economically incentivized to produce content, because that drives things through and provides a long-term future. And we're moving to a world where essentially, the danger we've got, I think, also, if you play it through, is that to some extent, we almost freeze the moment in time when ChatGPT came into existence. Because prior to ChatGPT, you got all this content that effectively is human generated. You've now got 50, 60, 70% of the content is AI generated, which already is worse for training models and so on. And people aren't incentivized to produce more. So we may end up with a sort of long-term future where effectively the sort of 2022 is the moment where effectively human culture of one sort almost freezes and becomes the sort of clean pre-AI generated content, and we then have the sort of AI stuff on top of it. And it's a bit like the sort of the whole thing about steel, which is when the nuclear bombs were exploded, effectively that put a layer of radioactivity into all the steel that was exposed to the air. And so that's the reason why World War II battleships are hunted down by people who want to pull them up, because that steel was protected below the surface of the ocean, and therefore it's a sort of higher quality steel. We may get to a similar thing with content, with these sort of treasure troves of human generated content that haven't been polluted by AI become these incredibly valuable things. But the danger is you kind of freeze your world at that 2022 moment. And obviously the content that's been frozen at that moment, there's obviously a temporal issue, but equally it's who produced that content. Well, it tends to be a certain type of North American content, etc. So I think there's some interesting things playing through in terms of, the underlying data that so far drives these models and where they go and how we take it forward. And clearly synthetic data is going to be unbelievably powerful in real world models in terms of helping robotics, self-driving cars and so on. But I think synthetic data in the human creative context that goes back to creating these figures you'd like to have, advising you and talking to you, I think it's going to be one of the really interesting challenges as we take it forward. And how do we find a way to keep good human beings producing good content, both for its own sake, but also to keep training models?
So, anyways, you had said to me in a conversation last week a particular phrase, the last and the first generation. Elaborate on that.
So that I think that we are uniquely privileged and also responsible. We're the first generation to be impacted by AI. It's coming through, it's changing our lives. But equally, the rules we set out at the moment will define probably what it means for our children, our grandchildren going forward, because they're probably also the last generation who can have an impact on AI. in terms of setting the rules of the road, in terms of regulation, in terms of what's happening. And I liken a little bit to, like, when the motor car came in. When the motor car came in, it started off with, the bloke walking with the red flag, slowing it down and so on. We're a bit there with AI at the moment. But over the course of that generation, they worked out, a bit longer, but over a while, they worked out, which side of the road you should drive on, what the rules of the road were, what the road signs were. At some stage, driving licenses, a bit further down, safety features inside the cars, and where the generation's responsibility is to make that happen. Because the motor car went on to kill millions of people, it drove multiple world wars. AI is going to have a similar impact on our society, but our job is to try and make it as safe as possible and as good as possible for human beings. And that's something why you want as many people aware of AI, understanding the questions, coming off things like this podcast, hopefully, to learn more about stuff, to really be in a place where they can be part of the conversation. Because if this conversation is purely driven by very, very smart people in Silicon Valley or very, very smart academics, both of whom are very smart but have a whole series of biases and limitations, and they don't reflect broader humanity, how can we get to a place where as many people as possible are part of that conversation? And that's why your podcast is such a good thing to help drive that conversation forward.
Excellent. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on. And where can we hear more from you? Tell us a little bit about your podcast so people can.
So I do the Age of Intelligence podcast, which is with the colleagues from INSEAD. So I went to business school there, and that's a thing we do. I also do quite a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, so please do follow me.
Excellent. Tim, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Enjoy that.